Okay, great. So let me check the audio. Awesome. All right, great. So sorry guys, just setting up a new kind of computer for this, but welcome back. We're talking about economics questions again today. Micro and macro specifically, we're going to go over a list of commonly asked questions, for right answers, why was for right answers, and then review a previous tutor's work to make sure that they also got it right as well and verify that solution. With that being said, we can just jump right in. So the first question says, which of the following is not true of inflation in general? A, it refers to a general increase in the price level. B, during periods of rapid inflation, prices of all goods are increasing. C, the annual inflation rate can be measured by finding the year-over-year percentage change in the CPI over Consumer Price Index. Or D, none of the above. It's basically testing our knowledge of what exactly does the term inflation refer to. So we know that generally inflation refers to the overall increase in price levels in the economy, right? The price levels that consumers are facing. So we can kind of look down the list and see how these different answer choices fit into our understanding of inflation. Now, A says it refers to a general increase in the price level, and that's what we just talked about, right? Inflation is just a general raise in prices. So A seems to be something that would be true, and so would not be the correct answer. B says that during periods of rapid inflation, prices of all goods are increasing. Now, this is a bit too generalized, right? To say that when inflation happens, every single good in the economy experiences a price increase is probably not true, right? We know that the way we calculate inflation, as C will refer to, is by looking at the year-over-year percentage change in the Consumer Price Index. And what that specifically means is that economists will assemble theoretical baskets of goods that represent the average kind of consumption or purchases of a family in a given amount of time, right? So you might say there's going to be you're including the price of eggs, you're including the price of bread, and it's possible that the price of one of those goods in the basket is going up significantly, but the prices of another good in the basket might actually be declining by a little bit. And it's just that the overall basket price has gone up, which is what we refer to as inflation. It's not necessarily that all goods contained within the basket went up by the same amount or went up at all, right? So that's, okay, I think, an important clarification, and that's why B is probably not true, right? So we're going to keep an eye on that one while we look at the other answer choices. C says that the annual inflation rate can be measured by finding the year-over-year percentage change in the CPI. And we just talked about this. That's correct. That's how we calculate inflation. So that would be true. And D says none of the above, but we already said that B is most likely not true. So B is going to be our best answer for this question. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. Previous tutor says, inflation shows a general trend as to wherever prices of basic goods are going, so it's true, that's true. B says that the statement is false. Rapid inflation will not mean that the price of all commodities is rising. Rather, it may be that the price of one basket good may fall, but is offset by an increase in the price of another commodity. It may also be the case that a commodity whose price has fallen is not taken into account in the calculation of CPI. That's also true. Remember, we said that the CPI baskets calculated by economists are just meant to be a snapshot of the typical family's expenditures in a given amount of time. You might not include the price of more expensive goods there, like cars or other goods that are more rarely purchased that might not represent the average consumption by a family. So those are all different reasons, again, that it's not necessarily true that when inflation occurs, that the prices of all goods go up. And then C says inflation is calculated by taking the difference in CPI over the years and dividing by the base, multiplying that by 100, and that is true as well. So great answer. We're going to mark that as correct, and we can move on to the next question. The next question says, which situation is the best example of opportunity cost? A country chooses to produce bananas instead of wheat. B, a country chooses to invest in manufacturing in agriculture. C, a country chooses to specialize in producing paper products. Or D, a country chooses to export all of its products, right? So the first thing we have to understand here is what is opportunity cost, right? And so opportunity cost is one of those concepts or principles that is fundamental to understanding economics, right? we know that the assumption that we go into economics with is that there is scarcity. Everything is scarce. Every resource is scarce. Time is scarce. Labor is scarce. So you can't have unlimited everything. And so what scarcity forces you to do is to make decisions and trade-offs. And those trade-offs are what we refer to as opportunity costs. When I make a decision to buy one good rather than another good, my opportunity cost is the good that I gave up, right? And so this is important to understanding basically decision-making in economics. So let's see which one of these answer choices fits into this idea of trade-offs the best. Now A says a country chooses to produce bananas instead of wheat, and right off the bat that seems like a really good answer for this question, right? A country can choose to dedicate its resources to production of either good X, bananas, or good Y, wheat, and when it chooses to dedicate its production to good X, then it cannot use any of those resources to produce good Y. And so this is a perfect example of an opportunity cost scenario. So we'll keep that in mind when we look at the other answers. B says a country chooses to invest in manufacturing and agriculture. And so again, anytime a country, you choose to do something, you are giving up something else. But this choice right now highlights only what the country has chosen to invest in, not what it has given up investment in, right? So that trade-off is what we're really looking for, and it's just we're not really seeing it in answer choice B here. So it's not going to be B. C says that a country chooses to specialize in producing paper products, and again, we don't know what the trade-off is here. We don't know what the country could have specialized in instead of paper products, and so we're just not really seeing explicitly the opportunity cost that we see in option choice A. And finally D, a country chooses to export all of its products, and that's more so a trade decision. It does not seem to really go into this decision-making process, and doesn't have that trade-off element either. So A is still going to be our best answer here. I'm going to go with that as the correct answer for this question. Now let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer, and the previous tutor also chose A. And they said that the country chooses to produce bananas instead of wheat because of the comparative cost advantage. Comparative advantage suggests a relative economic advantage enjoyed by trade partners to produce goods and services at a low opportunity cost, which is the cost of alternative opportunities sacrificed or given up. Opportunity cost is the cost involved in foregoing the next best alternative while making decisions. Opportunity cost establishes scarcity, and choice is a benefit that could have been derived by a person if he would have chosen the alternative. So it's a pretty good question, pretty good answer. They kind of go into this idea of comparative advantage. I think that's just a little bit more than you really need to know to answer this question. Comparative advantage goes into the production possibilities frontier, goes into trading, absolute and comparative advantage. Those are all really good concepts to understand for sure. For this question, you just have to know opportunity cost means trade-offs, and A is the best answer for trade-offs. And they kind of talk about that in the latter half of the explanation. So we're going to mark that as good and move on to the next question. So the next question says that when conducting an open market sale, the Fed does what? I think it just wants us to kind of explain what an open market sale is. And so what I'll say for an open market sale is it's one of the many tools that the Fed has when they're engaging in monetary policy. The Fed is the central bank in the United States, and one of the primary things they're trying to do is lessen the impacts of recessions or help the economy move in the long-term potential GDP amount, right? And so an open market sale is one of those things that the Fed can do in order to reduce the money supply. And what the Fed is doing with open market sale is it's basically selling treasury securities and bonds, which are financial instruments. And they're things that the public or companies can invest in by buying. And when you buy one of these bonds, you give the Fed your money, and the Fed says, in this amount of time, usually a 10-year or a 15-year treasury note maybe, we will give you your money back plus additional X% interest, right? And so it's basically an investment. And the short-term impact of that is that when the Fed engages in this open market sale, it's putting certificates, right, in securities and bonds, it's putting paper basically onto the market, and it's taking away currency. You're taking away money, you're taking away cash. And so that has the effect of reducing the amount of money in circulation, and that will accomplish whatever goals that the Fed might have, like for example, raising the interest rate and reducing investment spending, right? So that's what an open market sale really aims to do. It's one of those tools that the Fed uses to reduce the money supply and accomplish some of its monetary policy goals. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. The previous tutor says that the Fed sells U.S. Treasury securities and bonds, and this reduces the money supply. So again, exactly what we talked about. And they said that open market operations involve the sale and purchase of U.S. Treasury securities. They are used as an instrument of monetary policy to change the money supply in the economy. Open market sales are carried out by the Fed when the economy is undergoing inflationary pressure. The sale of government bonds and securities leads to a reduction in the money supply. As the amount of money in the market decreases, the spending capacity of the consumer contracts, which leads to a reduction in aggregate demand. Reduced aggregate demand brings the price level down. Yeah, so it's kind of a tie-in to how you'd see the effects of open market sales. But good explanation, and we can mark that as correct. Next question says, which scenario is the best example of an opportunity cost? Kind of echoing one of the questions we just had. And it says that for answer choice 1, a computer company produces fewer laptops to meet tablet demand. 2, a computer company issues a recall on its tablets. 3, a computer company reduces the price on last year's models. Or 4, a computer company stops making computers with CD or DVD drives. And so I think this is an opportunity cost, not from the point of a consumer, but from the point of a manufacturer or producer. So what they're going to see here is that the producer's opportunity cost is that it has a set amount of resources, right? It has a set number of factories, which is capital. It has a set number of employees, which is labor. It has a set amount of, human capital, which is what it can dedicate its R&D to. And so the question that the producer faces is, which product do I direct my resources towards producing, right? And so what we're looking for in opportunity cost is that when the producer dedicates his resources to producing good X, that means all those resources are no longer available for good Y, right? Computer parts that you put into making one good cannot be at the exact same time with the exact same parts be used to make another good, right? You can only make one good. So that's kind of a trade-off we're looking for. So let's see which one of these answer choices best fits with this idea of opportunity cost. One says a computer company produces fewer laptops to meet tablet demand. And right off the bat, again, this seems like a really good answer, right? A computer company has its resources. It can either produce laptops or tablets. And so it sees that tablets are more profitable. It decides to reorient its production towards tablets, and that means taking away production resources from laptops. So this is a really good example of the trade-off involved in opportunity cost. So let's keep an eye on that one. For answer choice 2, it says a computer company issues a recall on its tablets. And again, this seems to be less so associated with this idea of opportunity cost. There's not really a trade-off going on here. This is more like maybe like a product safety thing or a liability thing. So not really something that we're looking for in this question. 3 says a computer company reduces the price on last year's model. Again, not really sure what the trade-off is here. It's not really a production trade-off or a manufacturing trade-off, more so like a sales or marketing strategy. So that's not really going to be it. And finally, 4, a computer company stops making computers with CD or DVD drives. And again, it's not really about what the decision is, but what you gave up in the process of making that decision. So it's unclear if there's an opportunity cost here. Maybe the cost of CD, DVDs, drives are too high and they want to use the money somewhere else, maybe, but the answer choice doesn't really explicitly tell us. So I think 1 is still going to be the best answer here by far. So 1 is the correct answer here. And so let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer, and they also said 1. And they said that opportunity cost refers to the value of the next finest alternative foregone when an action is chosen. And they say that resources are scarce, and this scarcity prevents the production of all goods and services which humans may need or desire. At the same time, we are essentially mortals, and hence we cannot carry out all actions we may want to. Therefore, we need to choose the action which yields us the maximum benefit and incurs minimum cost is necessitated. Every time a decision is made, all alternatives are sacrificed in favor of one option, and the opportunity cost of that action becomes the value of the next best alternative that was foregone and which would have been chosen had the chosen option been unavailable. If a company has to produce more tablets to meet its demand, it will have to reduce the production of other goods to free and divert required resources. And I think this last line really sums it up very well about this trade-off that they're going to be facing. So good answer. And we're going to mark that as correct. Next question says, excess supply is created when price or blank moves away from the equilibrium point. We can draw this out on what that might look like. So you have your demand and supply. And so excess supply is when quantity supply is greater than quantity demanded. So you might have something like this. You have QS here, and then you have QD here, right? And what is the cause for this discrepancy, right? This is our excess supply or surplus, and the cause of this is obviously that the price has gone up from the equilibrium level, right? We have a higher price than normal, and we also, as a result, have two different quantities instead of an equilibrium between quantity demand and quantity supply. So the answer to this question, again, we're going back, is excess supply is created when price or quantity moves away from the equilibrium point, right? And so that's going to be the right answer here. It's either price or quantity. Those are the only two things that are really happening on this graph. Let me see if I can draw this out better. You have price and you have quantity. And so, right, so let's take a look at what the previous tutor said, and the previous tutor also said quantity. And they said that equilibrium is that the price is the price that producers and consumers agree upon. The corresponding quantity to this price is known as the equilibrium quantity. The diversion of price from the equilibrium point in the upward direction leads to an increase in quantity supplied, while decrease in quantity demanded that creates the situation of excess supply in the market, right? When the quantity supplied overwhelms quantity demanded, producers accumulate stocks and inventories. This pressures them to lower the prices as it's better to sell than accumulate and not sell at all. When some sellers initiate, others follow suit. Eventually, the equilibrium in the market gets restored. This is a good point. What we're essentially saying is that there's a downward pressure on this price. If there's no price controls, there's no price floor or anything like that. It's just some fluke that the price is too high. That there will be downward pressure that will correct this surplus situation back to the equilibrium, where you would have an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity, right? So just something to keep in mind. But yeah, that's a good answer. Next question says that household production, such as baking bread at home, is not included in GDP because it, 1, has better quality than the bread in the store, 2, does not involve a market transaction, 3, has lower quality than the bread in the store, or 4, does not add anything of value to GDP. And so if we can remember, the way we can calculate the GDP is primarily through this, is it comma? How do I do a text box? Let's see. We'll just do a shape, okay? Primarily through Y, or GDP, is equal to consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports, where net exports is equal to exports minus imports, right? Now this is our expenditure approach to GDP, calculating GDP, right? Now the question here is, okay, if we're calculating in this way, what about household production? Why isn't that included, right? And the answer is because we don't really know how to classify it into one of these categories. So you can, the reason for that is you might have records of buying the flour to make the bread, buying the yeast to make the bread, but the time spent making the bread is unpaid, right? You were making it at home, so you're not really being paid wages. The bread isn't being sold anywhere, so there's no market transaction to a consumer. You're just eating it yourself, and you're not paying for it. You're not paying yourself to eat it either, right? So really, it's really hard to measure household production because there's simply no records of what the value of that production might be, despite the fact that by all other definitions of GDP, we would categorize household production, such as baking bread, as productive work, right? And so this is basically getting at the idea that the GDP is not a perfect measure of productivity. There are things that get missed. Household production activities, baking bread, cooking food, cleaning the house, are all things that if you pay someone else to do them, you would count that as production. And by the simple fact that you're doing it yourself and you're not paying yourself, it is not counted as production. It's one of those things that GDP is missing, right? So let's break this down to the answer choices. One says it's not included because it is better quality than the bread in the store. If anything, that means it should be included at a higher level than the bread that we already count that is in the store, right? So that's not really going to get us anywhere. 2 says it does not involve a market transaction, and this is what we were really getting at, right? There's no records of the financial transaction going into this bread production, so we can't really measure it adequately, right? And so 2 is going to be a really good answer. Let's take a look at 3. Has lower quality than the bread in the store. That still means it should still be recorded. Just because it's not as good doesn't mean that productivity shouldn't be counted. And finally 4, it does not add anything of value to GDP, but obviously we don't count that. We don't think that's true, right? Because bread that's produced in the store is definitely adding value to GDP. Just making it at home, there's no argument for why the location where it's made suddenly means that production is less valuable to GDP, right? So that's not going to be the right answer either. So 2 is going to be the right answer here. It does not involve a market transaction. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. They also chose 2, and they said that one of the greatest shortcomings of GDP is that it fails to incorporate any economic activity that generates value but does not involve a market transaction. The greatest disadvantage of this implication is experienced in the exclusion of household work and production, which homemakers do, from the calculation of GDP. Bread produced at home for consumption, or any other household chore for that matter, does not find a place in official GDP statistics, as there was no money or good or service exchanged in return for the same. The measurement of its value is complex and ambiguous in nature due to a lack of relevant scale and efforts, hence it is entirely excluded, right? So it's a good explanation. Mark that as correct. The next question says, the market for which item generally involves pure competition? A, cola, B, corn, C, jeans, or D, ice cream? So let's review really quickly what we mean by pure competition. Pure competition is a pure competitive market characterized by ease of entry and exit into a market, many producers and buyers, so no one producer has price control or market power. Identical goods and services. If you went to one person to buy the good, it would be exactly the same as if you went to another person. So there's no product differentiation or anything like that. And so those are some of the main characteristics of pure competition. So let's see how we break this down among the answer choices. So A, cola. And let's talk about ease of entry and exit. Is it easy to enter a cola market? No, right? Like the production cost necessary to enter a cola market is fairly high. You would need to have your own recipe. You would have to have your own production facility. You would have to, have all these things. And so it would be pretty hard. And you're competing against very recognized brands like Pepsi or Coca-Cola that would make it very, very hard for anybody else to break into that market, right? And that kind of feeds into the second point, which is how many sellers are there? We know that there's basically like 2 or 3 sellers of cola in the world, right? And those are the primary producers. So there's a high degree of market power or price control among these sellers. They have very, very large market shares, and we don't fulfill the condition of a large number of sellers either. And finally, product differentiation. Some people might say there is product differentiation, others might not. I think it's generally accepted that most people consider Pepsi and Coke to be substitutes, right? They're largely, by and large, they taste the same, right? And so that might be a controversial view for some people, but in general, we think of these as yes, closely identical goods, so very little product differentiation. So that would fulfill maybe what we'd expect in a perfectly competitive market, but the other 2 criteria are not fulfilled. Let's talk about corn now. Corn, is there ease of entry and exit? Relative to other things, I would say yes, right? You only need some land, You need the cost of seeds is pretty low. It may be hard to expand because there's cost of tractors and all that stuff. But generally, if I wanted to grow corn, I could probably grow corn with a decent amount of land or like good weather, right? And so the barriers to entry and exit are pretty low. Now, what about the number of sellers? We know that there's no corn conglomerate, at least that I know of, right? Where they are the ones who control the entire market. We know that there's a lot of farmers that, especially in the United States, that corn is, I think, the largest, it's either corn or wheat, one of the largest agricultural products that there is. So there's a lot of people who are growing this. So largely speaking, the corn market has a lot of producers. And we can also see that if you look at individual farmers, they have very little control over the price that they get. If you look at markets where you're doing, you're buying futures, for example, that the prices are kind of set, and you're just kind of, farmers are hoping that market forces are going to be on their side when they set the prices. They're going to get that harvest season, right? So corn has fairly many sellers and a lot of price taking behavior, not much price setting behavior. And finally, what about product differentiation? And here we see the most clearest example of identical products, right? It's really hard, unless you're like a connoisseur of corn, to tell the difference between where your corn is coming from. And so one farmer's corn is probably going to taste the same as the next farmer's corn. And so again, it seems to us right now that all three of our criteria have been fulfilled, and corn is a really good candidate for an item that generally involves pure competition, or closest to pure competition. Let's take a look at C and D to check whether or not there's even a better one. Jeans, right? Is it hard to get into denim manufacturing? Maybe. There might be moderate barriers to entry. Are there a lot of sellers and buyers? I would say moderately. Like you have Levi's, I don't know, Abercrombie and Fitch, like American Eagle maybe. I'm not really sure. I'm not familiar with a lot of jeans brands, but there's a lot less people selling jeans than there are people selling corn, for example. So we would say that maybe there's a moderate number of sellers. It's not an oligopoly per se, but it's not necessarily many, let's say, sellers. And finally, product differentiation. We do see that there are people who differentiate. Levi's has their kind of signature little, like I guess like embroidery on the back pocket with the Levi's logo. So there is a situation here where you could have a degree of product differentiation, unlike with corn where it's just corn, right? So jeans is not going to be as good as corn. And then finally, ice cream. Barriers to entry and exit, probably lower. Number of sellers, a moderate number, right? You have Ben and Jerry's, Halo Top, plenty. I'm trying to think of other ice cream brands, but a few major brands and some other smaller, more local brands. And finally, product differentiation. And there's definitely room to differentiate ice cream. You can differentiate by flavors, by fat content, by sugar, by health. So there's more flexibility there for sure, right? So corn is going to be the best answer here for fulfilling those three criteria the best. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. And the previous tutor said that corn as well. And they said that pure competition is a term used to define a market structure where there are a massive amount of consumers or buyers as well as producers or sellers. As well as producers or sellers of a product like corn, which is homogeneous, meaning all sellers in the market are offering the same product, like corn, at the same price, and one producer of corn doesn't have any edge over the other corn producers because the product is identical in shape, size, color, and other attributes, which removes the option of one seller offering something different or better than other sellers. So they've really well explained this idea of identical products, but I think they've missed the two other criteria. So let's talk about those. Also, corn market has relatively lower barriers to market entry exit, which is another criteria of perfect competition. And finally, there are many producers of corn, i.e. farmers, corn farmers, that which would also reduce the market power of producers and force all producers to be price takers rather than price setters. Okay? But the solution is correct, and so we'll still mark that's correct. The next question says, according to classical theory, the economy is self-regulating. If it's in a recessionary gap, what happens? The options are wages rise, the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts leftward, and both real GDP and the price level rise. Second says wages fall, the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts rightward, the price level falls, and real GDP rises. Third says wages fall, short-run aggregate supply curve shifts leftward, and the price level rises and real GDP falls, or D, none of the above. So let's break this down. So this is going to be testing our knowledge of the dynamic aggregate demand aggregate supply model. Let's draw that out. So let me try to make it a little bit prettier. We still have price level on the on the y-axis, production on the x-axis. We have our aggregate demand curve. We have our short-run aggregate supply curve. And then in the intersection, this is at equilibrium, you have our long-run aggregate supply curve. So at equilibrium, this is what we expect, right? In both the short term and the long term. And this long-run aggregate supply curve is a vertical line because it represents full employment, potential GDP, right? So it's the long-term GDP goal we would see in the future. So that's the default equilibrium. Now the question tells us it's in a recessionary gap. So what does that mean? It essentially means that the overall the short-run equilibrium quantity is less than the what's it called? Long-run aggregate supply potential GDP curve. So it would look something like this. If it's on the aggregate demand side, we would have aggregate demand 1 intersecting short-run aggregate supply, and we would have a short-run GDP level at, let's call it X, right? And that's less than the full employment level at long-run aggregate supply curve. We'll call this Z, right? Now, this is the situation we find ourselves at in the short run. The classical theory says the economy is self-regulating, so somehow this graph needs to end up at an equilibrium point back on long-run aggregate supply. That's what self-regulating means. Without any government intervention, we would be able to do this. And so what do we see here? Okay, so this recessionary gap, two things are happening. One thing is there's deflation, right? The price level has gone down. And the second thing is that unemployment has gone up, right? If we draw this out in the market level, in the labor market, we have our labor demand and labor supply. Unemployment looks like excess labor supply and what's it called? Excess labor supply over demand, right? So this is our unemployment level. And what you essentially see during a recessionary gap is that unemployment is going up. And so what that does is because there's more people willing to work, the wages are going to fall, right? And so wages are going to fall is one of the categories in the question, and we can eliminate answer choice A because answer choice A says wages are rising. The second thing that we're noting is what is the effect of a decrease in wages on short-run aggregate supply? Well, we know that wages are a factor of a production cost for firms, right? How much you pay your employees is definitely going to inform how much you're able to produce in terms of goods and services. And so if the wages fall, what we're going to see is that the short-run aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the right, right? And so that looks something like this. We're going to have this rightward shift. And to what degree is it going to shift to the right? Well, it's going to keep shifting as long as wages are falling until you reach a point where it looks something like this. Right? And so now what we see is we've returned back to the long-run aggregate supply curve at a lower price level, right? This low price level, sorry, I think I took a level wrong. This low price level right here, it's our new price level after we had a recessionary gap and then the economy self-corrected back towards the long-run aggregate supply curve. And so which one of these answer choices most matches this process, right? So we said wages fall is the first part. And then the second part is that the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts rightward to compensate for a wage shift. And so that's going to eliminate C, right? But we have to make sure that the rest of this is true, otherwise we have to go with none of the above. So does price level rise or fall? It's falling, that's true. And then real GDP rises. And we see that we went from X back to Z, so real GDP also rose. So answer choice B is going to be best answer here because it kind of encompasses the entire process by which we went through to get back to the long-run aggregate supply potential GDP level. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. And the previous tutor says that according to classical theory, the economy is self-regulating. This means that prices and wages are fully flexible. If the economy is in recessionary gap, then unemployment is increasing or is greater than the natural rate of unemployment. In other words, the supply of labor is exceeding the demand for labor at the current wage rate. With wages being flexible, this excess of supply over demand will result in a fall in the wage rate. Fall in wage rate will reduce the cost of production of firms and increase their profit margins, prompting them to produce more. This increases the aggregate supply in the economy, and the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift rightwards. Given the aggregate demand curve, this rightward shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve results in a fall in price level and a rise in real GDP. Hence, the correct option is answer 2. Yeah, exactly. So same logic that we went through. Nothing's really added there, which is great. Okay, let's move on to question 7. According to the classical economists, which of the following statements is true? 1, financial markets ensure that 1, interest rate flexibility will ensure that planned savings is equal to planned investment. 2, there's a direct relationship between the amount individuals plan to save and the interest rate. Higher rates cause people to save more and lower rates reduce savings. 3, interest rates determine how much businesses and firms invest. Higher interest rates reduce investment and lower rates increase investment. So we have our 3 answer choices here, and then we have all of the above are true. So really we're trying to look at the financial market's effect on interest rates, right? Okay. Number 1, interest rate flexibility will ensure that planned savings is equal to planned investment. So this is the idea that savings is equal to investment, and this is true, right? And the financial market basically matches up borrowers and savers so that everybody who's planning on saving their money has somewhere that they can put their money to lend and earn interest. And everybody who wants to borrow money is being paired up with somebody who's willing to loan them the money for a short period of time. So that's fine. Second says that there's a direct relationship between the amount individuals plan to save and interest rates. Higher interest rates cause people to save more and lower rates reduce savings. And again, this is also true. You can imagine when you open up a savings account, one of the things you might be looking at is how much is the interest rate. And if the interest rate on a savings account is high, you're gonna be more likely to put more money into savings, right? If I promise you some sort of crazy interest rate like 10% or 25% a year, I guarantee you people will be putting in a ton of money into savings. Whereas if I give you a lower interest rate like 0% or 0.01%, there's really no incentive to put as much into savings, right? Because it's not earning that much. You could put it into something else. And so there is that direct relationship between how high the interest rate is and how much people are saving. And finally, interest rates determine how much businesses and firms invest. Higher interest rates reduce investment and lower rates increase investment. This is also true. We're now, instead of taking a look from the savings perspective, we're looking at the borrower's perspective. And from the borrower's perspective, you want low interest rates. If I'm borrowing $100,000, if you promise me a 0% interest rate, I'm much more likely to make that borrowing because I know that I only have to pay back the principal. Whereas if I told you you have a 10% interest rate or a 20% interest rate on your loan, then investment is going to go down because nobody really wants to pay that much in just interest payments, right? And so you're basically making loaning and investment more expensive. So this is also true. There is that inverse relationship between the two. And so we can see that all 3 of these are true, so we're going to have to select all of the above as our correct answer here. Let's take a look at the previous tutor answer, and I don't think they actually answered it, so we can say all of the above, all the listed statements accurately described the relationship between interest and various economic factors. Okay, 8 says, And then we can go to question 10. If actual real GDP is greater than the full unemployment rate, if actual real GDP is greater than the full employment real GDP, then the actual unemployment rate is which of the following? So what we're looking at is an inflationary gap, right? In a situation where actual GDP is greater than full employment real GDP, we'll draw our dynamic aggregate demand, aggregate supply model again. That's our equilibrium. And then what this was telling us is that the real GDP right now is right here, which we can see is higher than the full long run GDP level. Short run aggregate supply, and this is long run. Right, so this is what we refer to as an inflationary gap. On the other side, it's a recessionary gap. On this side, it's an inflationary gap. Okay, what does this tell us? So basically it tells us the economy is basically stretching itself thin by producing so much at a higher rate than is in the long run efficient, right? And so we would expect there to be very low unemployment here, even lower than the natural rate of unemployment, because the economy is overproducing, and so we would expect overemployment. So the unemployment rate is probably going to be less than the natural rate of unemployment, and then we know that there's an inflationary gap. So let's take a look at these answer choices. One says greater than the natural rate of unemployment and an inflationary gap. We said that there would be less than the natural rate of unemployment. 2 says less than the natural rate of unemployment, which is good, but then they say recessionary gap, and we say this is an inflationary gap. C says greater than the natural unemployment rate. Again, we said less than. D says less than the natural unemployment and an inflationary gap. That's the correct answer here. And finally, E, equal to the natural unemployment and no gap exists. That's false, right? And so it's going to be D here. In answer choice 10, D is correct. When real GDP is greater than full employment real GDP, we have an inflationary gap. In this scenario, economy is overproducing, so we would expect labor to be overutilized. This results in a lower than natural rate of unemployment. Okay, well the solution is, we'll mark it as incorrect because we're missing 2 other solutions, so now this can be added on. Next question says, which investment type typically carries the least risk? A says mutual funds, B says treasury bonds, C says savings accounts, and D says individual stocks. Let's break this down for a kind of a recap. What is a mutual fund? A mutual fund is basically a pre-assembled portfolio of stocks and bonds, which allows you to, at a very low cost, diversify your portfolio by investing in very, very small chunks of different companies. And so rather than buying one stock in Apple, one stock in Google, one stock in Amazon, you might have a mutual fund which already has holdings in all of those areas, and you can just buy a small percentage of the overall portfolio of the mutual fund, which gives you small chunks. So you have one share of a mutual fund which has like 33% Apple, 33% whatever the other companies I talked about, and so on and so forth. So that's your mutual fund. Generally accepted that diversification is good. It reduces risk, but you're still diversifying in the stock market, which is inherently very volatile. So that's what we have with mutual funds. B says treasury bonds, typically considered to be very, very safe. They're bonds issued by the government, and so it's unlikely that the government will I forgot the exact term, like bankrupt or will be unable to pay back the money that you loan to the government, we would expect. So treasury bonds typically are very safe, and by that sense, they carry very low interest rates because they're so safe, right? And so they're very safe as an investment type, but they're still a type of investment. So now C says savings account, and this is extremely safe, right? Savings account is money that we don't really even consider as investment. Right? Treasury bonds, you're still investing. Savings account, you're not even really investing. It's simply somewhere to put your money, and it typically earns very low rates of return. You have some ability to withdraw money from that when you need it. And a lot of banks these days with savings accounts are FDIC insured, which means that if the bank were to go bankrupt, that the federal government would pay back your savings account amount up to a certain amount. And so there's some kind of inherent insurance tied to most savings account and commercial banks these days. And so with that in mind, savings account is even more safe, I would say, than treasury bonds, because with treasury bonds, you still think of it as an investment. With a savings account, it's really just somewhere to put your money, right? And so that's kind of a even more safe option. And finally, D, individual stocks. We talked about this, that among the four of these options, individual stocks are probably the most volatile. Stock prices change every day. You might have a 5% peak today, a 10% decline tomorrow. And so it's really very risky to do just individual stock investment. So savings account is probably the most safe here. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. And they said C as well. And they said a savings account typically carries a lower risk, is a risk-free way to earn some nominal amount of interest on money. Savings account represents bank deposits made by the people in the bank or other financial institutions. These accounts pay interest, which is very low, but the money of the bank is money of the people is secure in these accounts in the bank. These accounts are flexible and people are able to withdraw money when they require for their needs. Savings accounts are a good method for saving money for a short period of time or to take care of an emergency. And so this is good. Good answer. The next question says the primary difference between a change in supply and a change in the quantity supplied is that A change in quantity supplied is a movement along the supply curve, while a change in supply is a shift in the supply curve. Okay. B says both a change in quantity supplied and a change in supply curve are movements along the supply curve only in different directions. C says a change in supply is related to the supply curve, while a change in quantity supplied is related to shifts in the demand curve that elicit a change in supply. And D says a change in supply is a movement along the supply curve, while a change in quantity supplied is a shift in the supply curve. So let's draw this out. This is our supply curve, and there's two things we're talking about. One is a movement, which is something like this, and another is a shift, just something like this. And the main difference between the two is exactly what it sounds like. Movement is simply the curve is staying the same. You're reaching a different point because the price has changed. If price has gone up, then the quantity supply goes up. Price goes down, quantity supply goes down. But the curve has not shifted at all. That's a movement. Meanwhile, a change in supply, I see that. Okay, so that's what we would call a change in quantity supplied, right? Movement from the curve at this point to this point would be an increase in quantity supplied by this much, right? And that's simply a reflection of the price change. A change in supply rather than quantity supplied is referring to a shift. That at every single price level, right, at this price level right here, that the quantity supplied has gone up. At this price level right here, the quantity supplied has still gone up. That's what we refer to as a shift in the supply curve. And so that's the main difference, that ability to identify what is the cause of the change. Is a change in supply, is it a change in supply because the supply determinant has changed, like a factor of production cost, or is it a movement on the supply curve due to a change in price? So that's what we're really looking at, and A is going to be the best answer here. A change in quantity supplied is a movement along the supply curve, while a change in supply is a shift in the supply curve, right? So A is the best answer here. And so next, the correct answer about the previous tutor put is B. And then let me review really quickly what B says. Both a change in quantity supplied and a change in supply are movements along the supply curve, only in different directions. And this explanation doesn't really fit. I think this is just a mismatched question. So we're going to say incorrect. The correct answer is A shift in supply, a change in supply refers to a change in quantity supplied at every price level, i.e. a shift. A change in quantity supplied refers to a change in price causing a change in quantity supplied, i.e. a movement. Okay, so the solution is incorrect because I think they paired the wrong answer, and we can mark that as incorrect. Next question says, what happens when the Federal Reserve limited the money supply? 1 says the limited access to currency stifled business growth. 2 says the slow release of money kept the value of the US dollar high. 3 says the value of stocks slowly recovered with a tight-fisted policy. And 4 said more money went into business rather than into the stock market. So what do we really think is happening with money supply when the Fed reduces the money supply? So we look at the money supply market. We have our money supply and money demand, right? So this is demand for money. This is the money supply. And it's just a straight line because there's only one finite amount of money in circulation at any given point in time. On the y-axis, we have interest rates. On the x-axis, we have quantity of money. So if you limit the money supply, let's say you're reducing the money supply, you're really shifting the supply curve to the left, right? You have a new supply curve on the left. And the really big impact of that is a change in interest rates. Your interest rate has gone up. What is the effect of that on the rest of the economy? And what that essentially means is that if interest rates go up, we reviewed this in the other question talking about the relationship between interest rates and investment spending. But if interest rates have gone up, that means that business investment is going to go down. Businesses will typically borrow money to engage in investments, but now that your interest rate has gone up, effectively the cost of borrowing has gone up, right? You're expecting to pay more when you borrow money than you used to. And to do that would discourage investment spending. And so that discouragement results in a shrinking of the aggregate demand curve as businesses engage in less and less investment. So on the aggregate demand curve, it's going to look something like this, right? It's going to look like leftward shift. So that is one of the effects of the Federal Reserve's limiting the money supply. So let's take a look at which one of these is the correct answer here. So first option says the limited access to currency stifled business growth, and that seems to be a pretty good answer, right? I'm not sure if it's limited access to currency and more so that the higher interest rate tied with the currency, but it's still accurate to say that the limitation of currency is decreasing growth of business, right, in terms of investment spending. So that's still probably true. 2 says that the slow release of money kept the value of the US dollar high. Unsure, at least that seems to be more of an exchange rate thing, not really related to what we're talking about here, so not really pertinent. C says the value of stocks slowly recovered with a tight fiscal policy. And so there is a relationship between monetary policy and interest rates as well as stocks, but it's not really the direct impact of this kind of limitation policy. And finally, 4, more money went into business rather than into the stock market. Unclear where that relationship comes from. And from what we understand, that this decrease in money supply leads to a higher interest rate, it would mean that less money goes into investment in businesses. And so 1 still seems to be the best answer here. So 1 says, and the previous tutor also agrees with 1. So at first, the previous tutor said that the limited injection of money in the market leads to a contraction of money supply that causes, a contraction of money supply, causing a decrease in the price level. Subsequent deflation reduces market profitability and slows down the level of business activity. When the Federal Reserve limited the money supply, commercial banks faced a liquidity crunch due to an increase in their interest rates. The increase in interest rate meant an increase in the cost of borrowing for firms and individuals, which led to a decrease in the level of investment in the economy. The limited access to currency stifled business growth. So yes, that's good. And we'll mark that as correct. The next question says, what is the general relationship between the business cycle and unemployment and inflation? So we typically see the business cycle as something like this, where there's an average line that it follows, but there's going to be, that's pretty bad, but there's going to be peaks and troughs, there's going to be recovery periods and decline recession periods, right? And so these are our kind of elements of a business cycle. And how does this relate to unemployment and inflation? Well, we would expect that during inflation, right, during a growth period or a peaking period, that inflation would be high, that price levels would go up because the short and aggregate demand, the intersection of aggregate demand and short and aggregate supply is greater than the potential GDP of the economy. You're above this line, right? In that sense, we would expect inflation to be high. We'd also expect unemployment to be low. We would expect that when the economy is doing very well and during a business cycle it's at its peak, that there's a lot more jobs, there's a lot more production, and so there's less unemployment. And so that's kind of what we'd see on that side of the spectrum. On the other side, if you're in a recession, you're at the trough, you expect there to be lower price levels, you're in a recessionary gap, so it's not really you're going to see that the intersections to the left of the long ragged supply curve, and you would have lower prices. You'd also find there would be high unemployment, right? During a recession, we talk about high unemployment numbers. There's less jobs, there's less production going on, and so people are hiring less, and so there'll be lower levels of unemployment. And so in that sense, we would reflect on that as well. So that's the general relationship. Let's take a look at the previous tutor said. The previous tutor said that a business cycle refers to the upward and downward movement of the GDP of an economy in the long term, represented in the form of sine wave. This is our sine wave, illustrating the fluctuation between the period of expansion that comprises economic growth and contraction that comprises relative stagnation. In the expansionary phase of a business cycle, the unemployment rate falls and the inflation rate increases, whereas in the recessionary phase of a business cycle, unemployment rate increases and the inflation rate falls. So good. Mark that as correct as well. And the next question says, when the Federal Reserve Bank, i.e. the Fed, conducts open market purchases, it increases the market supply, it decreases the market supply, it has no effect on the money supply, or all of these. And again, this echoes kind of a previous question we went over today, but open market purchasing is when the government is buying back treasury bonds from banks or from individuals or from companies, and it's basically giving you back your money, right? And so plus interest. And so what that really is it's an influx of money into the economy. You're increasing the amount of money in circulation. And so A is going to be the best answer here, right? You're taking back paper and you're putting back currency. And so this is going to be the kind of effect that we see with this change. And so A is the correct answer here. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. Previous tutors also said A, and they said the open market operation is an instrument of the Federal Reserve System's monetary policy, which involves the purchase and sale of securities in the open market. These securities may include U.S. Treasury bonds, Treasury bills, or obligations of federal agencies. Federal open market operation is a monetary tool used by the Fed to control the money supply in the economy. When the Federal Reserve wishes to increase the money supply, it undertakes open market operations in terms of the purchase of Treasury securities. This purchase of Treasury securities increases the excess reserves with the banking system, which drives down interest rates given the money multiplier, brings the desired increase in the money supply. Good. We mark that as correct. Next question says, which of the following is a normative statement? A says the higher is the level of taxes, the lower is consumption spending. B says the higher is the level of taxes, the higher are wages demanded, or wage demands. C says a reduction in export taxes on petroleum will result in higher wages. D says tuition fees should be waived for low-income students. And E says a free trade agreement between two countries will result in an increase in trade. So a normative statement is going to be contrasted against a positive statement. A normative statement is a statement of opinion of something that is debatable, that people might disagree upon, whereas a positive statement is more of an observation of fact or accepted theory of what we'd expect to see generally with the knowledge that we have. I think a trick to use when you're trying to identify normative statements is essentially looking for the word should. If a word, it's very hard for me to imagine a context in which using the word should would be a positive statement. A normative statement is something that implies an opinion, and saying someone should or should not do something is an opinion. So in this case, D is the one that stands out to me for saying tuition fees should be waived for low-income students. And again, upon further inspection, we would say that this is in fact a normative statement, right? Some people might disagree. Some people might not think that low-income students should have tuition fees waived. And so the other option choices are all more accepted or positive statements of what we'd expect to see given an economic change. And so D is the only one that we would see maybe disagreement for. So we're going to go with that. And let's take a look at the previous tutors' answers. And they say the correct answer is D. Normative economics examines economic events from the moral and ethical point of view, used to judge whether the economic events are describable or not. The answers A, B, C, and E are incorrect because they are positive economics. Just to clarify, normative statements are statements of opinion. And so mark that as correct. A blank is the act of working in exchange for an income. 1, production. 2, consumption. 3, employment. 4, none of the above. I think this one's pretty simple. Between these answer choices, employment is the act of working in exchange for an income. So let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. They also picked employment. And he said the act of working in any capacity for an income is known as employment, is a contract between two parties in which one party, the employee, agrees to lend his or her or its services, physical and or mental, to the other party, the employer, which may be for a variety of organizations in exchange for payments in some form. Parties agree to the terms of employment of the contract, which is governed by employment and organizational law. Good. I mean, that was pretty in-depth, but I think most people would understand that's what employment refers to. The next question says, the model of competitive markets relies on these three core assumptions. 1, there must be many buyers and sellers, and few players can't dominate the market. Okay. 2, firms must produce an identical product. Buyers must regard all sellers' products as equivalents. Okay. 3, firms and resources must be fully mobile, allowing free entry into and exit from the industry. Okay, so we talked about these in the previous question. The first two conditions imply that all consumers and firms are price takers. While the third is not necessary for price-taking behavior, assume for this problem that a market cannot maintain competition in the long run without free entry. Identify whether or not each of the following scenarios describes a competitive market, along with the correct explanation of why or why not. So we have a scenario and whether it's competitive. Okay, the government has granted the U.S. Postal Service the exclusive right to deliver mail. So right off the bat, we see that that means there's only one mail carrier, right? And that breaks our assumption for the idea that a perfectly competitive market must have many, many providers or producers. And so this is definitely not going to be a competitive market. We would call that a monopoly. 2, several stores in the mall sell hooded sweatshirts. Each store's sweatshirts reflects the style of that particular store. Additionally, some makers use higher quality cotton than others, which is reflected in the apparel's prices. So here it's the second criteria, that all goods are identical, that is not fulfilled. When you have different styles or product differentiation, it's no longer a perfectly competitive market because each producer has a monopoly in its own narrow range of goods. And we call this monopolistic competition. And so this is not going to be a perfectly competitive market. C says, 2 taxi companies serve most of the market in a big city. Consumers don't care which taxi company they take. If they decide it's worth taking a taxi, they flag down the nearest one. So again, we're breaking that first criteria. If you only have 2 taxi companies, that's not what we would call many producers, right? So this is what we refer to as an oligopoly, where a few firms dominate the entire market. And so it's not going to be perfectly competitive. And finally, there are dozens of pasta producers that sell pasta to hundreds of Italian restaurants nationwide. The restaurant owner buys the cheapest pasta producer available. This is the closest to perfect competition. We have many, many producers, or dozens of pasta producers, selling virtually identical products, right? They're just all selling pasta. The restaurant owner clearly isn't saying one pasta producer is better than the other ones because it's just buying the cheapest one. And finally, probably free entry and exit in this market, right? It's pretty easy to start making pasta at home. So we would call that the closest to perfect competitive, so we could call that competitive. So let's take a look at the previous year's answer. They say USPS is not because it's one seller, right? They said sweatshirts are not because there's differentiation. They said taxi companies are not because there's only 2 sellers. And they said Italian restaurants, this is perfect competition because there are many sellers selling identical products. So good. We mark that as correct. Next question says, how do lower prices tend to affect demand? 1 says they tend to decrease the interest in the product. 2 says they tend to increase the interest in the product. 3 says they tend to decrease the availability of a product. And 4 says they tend to increase availability of a product. Law of demand tells us that when price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. I'm not sure if interest is the best way to describe this, but it's definitely not availability. That's on the producer side. So I guess interest has to be one of the right answers. So if prices go down, then we would expect increased interest or quantity demanded for a product. So 2 is the right answer here. Let's take a look at the previous year's answer. They also said 2. And he said that when prices are low, goods and services enjoy a greater amount of attention from consumers. Low prices allow consumers to consider for purchase options. Since their limited budget supports lower prices with a greater room, the law of demand tells us that the quantity demanded of a normal good is inversely related to its price. Decreasing price increases the real income of consumers, allowing them to increase their quantity demanded. Lower price tends to increase the interest in a product. Yeah, so that's a good way of looking at it. And we'll mark that as correct. And I think that's all we have for today. So hopefully that was helpful. We'll be doing this again next week. And other than that, I hope that everybody enjoys the rest of their weekend. Take care, guys.